It is interesting to me that under our Constitution and otherwise, that we compensate people if we take their property. Shouldn't we compensate people if they were property sanctioned by the state, sanctioned by the state, sanctioned by the state? So I believe that is a conversation that's worth having. And I see that as right and wrong. I don't see that as political or non-political.
Nobody alive today in 2019 was a slave back then. So what are we getting paid for? Who's getting paid? Why are they getting paid? It's no more than a campaign promise from Democratic hopefuls trying to get some kind of attention out here.
ABL. Listen, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. They provide economic restitution to those people. Now, if I came into your house, Mr. ABL, and I stole $1,000 from you and then I died, or if I stole $1 million from you and then I died, would you say, oh, well, Reese died, so the money doesn't matter anymore? No, you would go talk to my children because my children are still living off the benefits of that $1 million.
Just because somebody's granddad stole something doesn't mean I'm responsible for it. If somebody's granddad was a serial killer and then they find out 100 years later, you don't go after the kids and say, okay, you got to go to jail now, or you got to pay back some money because of what your grandfather did. It makes no sense. You know who did it. You should have been able to catch them while they were alive, punish them while they were alive.
We want to focus on is the economic harm that was done to black people. If we really break down what slavery was, people were brought from across the water to work, and that was free labor. So what we have is generations and years, hundreds of years of systematic discrimination and shutting out of economic access to black people, and that has to be repaid.
If we're going to blame the government of the USA, even though nobody is alive even though nobody's alive right now, 2019, that was alive back then, and then the thing about it is, who's going to pay it? You're talking about the government. The government is funded by the people. That means me, that means you will pay for it. So how does it make any sense? Like I said, it would have been more reasonable to have the former slave owner pay the slave when reparations would have been due, which is at the end of slavery, not right now. It makes no sense. This whole argument, it's no logic here.
America's never even studied the effects of slavery on black people. They've never sat down and said, we know that as a government we sanction this experience, but we don't even know how far that experience reaches because no one's ever studied it. How much do we owe black people? No one's ever studied it. Why? Because the government has literally buried its head. It's paid out everybody else and turned its back on the black people in America who have given so much to want to just strive to be a part of this country and with their blood, sweat, and tears.
They paid the money when it was due,
whether it's 150 years. That's irrelevant. The point is the effects are still there. How long are we going to continue this narrative? 200 years, 300 years, 5,000 years? How long are we going to continue the narrative? At what point do we say we're past slavery? We're going to stop it now because the buck stops here. Hopefully my generation will stand up and say that the buck stops here so we don't have to go on with this any longer.
I know that there's a lot of disagreement both about whether it should be done and if it were done, how it would be done. I'm not naive about that. But I do think that dark cloud still hangs over our country. I believe that we ought to move forward in the 21st century as one nation with one destiny, and that until that issue is resolved, until that original sin is addressed, we may think that we're moving forward as one nation, and I don't think that we ever really will. And I don't think that we ever really will. And I don't think that we ever really will. And I don't think that we ever really will. And I don't think that we ever really will.
Because we're entering the age of AI, we're going to have self-driving cars and trucks in 5 to 10 years. 30% of malls are going to close in the next 4 years, thanks to Amazon. 2.5 million call center workers in the U.S. are going to get replaced by AI. There was a study in The Guardian that said the median African-American household net worth is going to be 0 by 2053, like in 34 years. You guys see that study?
No.
Well, yeah, you should look it up. And so why are they forecasting that African-American net worth is going to go to 0? It's because of this economic tidal wave that is coming. This economic tidal wave is going to wipe out many working-class jobs. and it's going to be the equivalent of a natural disaster. And we know what happens in a natural disaster. Who suffers? Poor people who don't have the resources, people of color.
Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. But you never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. Two Latin words, ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
Turn it up. Look, 100 years after 100 years, they done lied to us about this and that. Told us all we from Africa. I made fiction characters turn into facts. Heard your time and then it was not. Knowing goddamn well that trick was capped. My wife and I wrote a book about it. It's a book with knowledge, evidence, and fact. And my other book got them haters shook, cause it's helping mind people take a closer look at their backgrounds in the background, showing mind people where they supposed to look. Showing mind people where they get it from, where they hit it from, all sorts of angles. When it comes to this research, you must please first, don't trust strangers. Find out all on your own is what I highly recommend and suggest. And if you looking for answers and content about me, I highly recommend you the best. Which is my website at the link you see just across the screen. Don't let it miss you. I make it simple. I double down on that black and white. It's too official.
Throughout today's society of America, people are suffering from a variety of distractions that are placed in the forefront of the public's eye in order to maintain a particular degree of division amongst themselves. And when it comes to the history of slavery in America, some may feel as though slavery was abolished in 1865, when it was merely upgraded and transitioned into what it is known today as, which is employment. The industrialized version of what President Woodrow Wilson and his administration, along with multiple other co-conspirators like Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and the University of Chicago, just to name a few, created and enacted into law for the benefit of 1% of the people. And their social engineering experiment also included control over things that would affect one's mindset, controlling what is known as American history, religion, science, social media, and public education. In 1909, in front of a large set group of law advisors and educators, President Woodrow Wilson was quoted stating the following: "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privileges of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific difficult manual tasks." End quote. In other words, compulsory educational institutions, which does not exclude colleges and universities, were handed down particular curriculums that taught its students how to become industrial providers that will benefit already existing companies of the open market throughout America's capitalist society, while the other class will be provided a much higher quality education, to say the least, allowing its students to think freely and become innovators in having control. Making excellence inclusive rather than inclusive will require revolutionary change, not just in our practices, but also in our mindsets. Dr. Carl Snyder. Now, since you have been made cognizant of how a liberal education was designed for only 1% of the people, that should make you question everything that you were ever taught in school, even if you earned a doctrine or any form of degree for that matter. Because it's not about you being taught the best education possible when you were being taught lies as your education to begin with. It's now beyond black and white issues. It's what's wrong and right issues. For example, over the years, the descendants of the indigenous Aboriginal Niji of Turtle Island, or rather the people that are falsely misclassified as African Americans today, are owed a lot more than just a form of reparations, and those who feel as though they should be paid for their direct ancestors' involvement with the creation and industrialization of the United States of America should be paid. However, just a simple check or lump sum of money given by those who benefited from our ancestors' labor to make amends for the now over 240 years of hereditary damage this capitalist society indulged upon our ancestors does not, in fact, resolve the overall issue. And here's why. Let's take the definition of reparations, for example, the one which is heavily highlighted to the public, stating that reparations is an act of making amends or giving satisfaction for wrongdoing, maybe in a form of payment for damages. But let's look at another definition for reparations, which is an act of repairing or keeping in repair. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Sort of like when you take your car to a mechanic who has plans to fix the initial problem with your car, but somehow more damage is done, so that at a later time you are sure to return to continuously allow that same bad mechanic to work on your car unknowingly. Or I'll give you another example. It's like when you visit your doctor and he or she prescribes you a pill that allegedly cures one problem, but yet it somehow exposes you to several more. This is the problem with reparations. It does not fix the problem. It just covers it up for a certain time period, and yet the problem still persists. Because in order to fix a problem, we must begin at the root of a problem. This is why it is critically important for our people to know the truth about our past in order to see exactly where the problem began. In my previous documentary called The Untold Truth About Reparations, ADOS, and Slavery in America, I shared detailed information about the Civil War, why and how it was a labor dispute, and I also mentioned that Abraham Lincoln did not free so-called African American slaves with the release of the Emancipation Proclamation, or Proclamation 95. But what President Lincoln's Proclamation 95 did do, however, was ended the Civil War by quelling the advancement of military troops upon any people or person who did not agree with the United States government. Instead of fighting, it was urged by politicians for people to bring their disputes to Congress, but only through a representative of each state. This is how the United States was established, having learned how to govern the 13 colonies by watching the operations of the previous confederacies our ancestors owned. I will go into more detail about this later on in another segment, but what is important to note here is that in order to restore the Union upon the remaining confederacies that would eventually turn into governments of each state, a set of reparations had to be agreed upon in favor of the copper-colored landowners, sharecroppers, or the Negro farmers, making this one of the main possible reasons why Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Now, reparations could have been delayed for the people of color due to a few factors. One, a study has never been conducted by any creditable source in order to discover just how much in a form of payment should the employees between 1776 and now be compensated for their binding contracts of forced labor. 2. There were subdivisions doing business as institutions, agencies, banks, and corporations that history fails to mention who worked as liaisons of the U.S. government, directly involving themselves with funding both sides of the 61 documented wars of the 1800s by creating loopholes and other schemes that forced our ancestors out of their own lands here in America, and also with streamlining the industrialized version of slavery that still exists today. 3. These companies were never held responsible for their actions in a courtroom, which makes it even more reason to reveal who should be held responsible still in order to bridge the gap between justice and equality for the indigenous Aboriginal Niji right now. The majority of bonds that were paid off by employers in order to hire prisoners of war as their new employees were done so by either bartering or loaning contracts out to employers as a form of business credit. This method remains intact still today. A bond is a, quote, promise to repay the principal along with interest on a specific date. Some bonds do not pay interest, but all bonds require a repayment of principal. When an investor buys a bond, he or she becomes a creditor of the issuer, end quote. So since the so-called slave master, or rather the employer, becomes the creditor, and the so-called slave holder, or rather the issuer of the bond, is the investor, then both parties are not only responsible for funding slavery, but should be held responsible for refunding the so-called slaves. Keep in mind that our ancestors were under the impression that they were not working for free, and that this form of slavery or blind capitalism will benefit everyone, especially those who were the majority of the help that literally built America from the ground up, due to promises or contracts that were never upheld by the promising parties. Hence the term indentured servitude. The noun indenture is a, quote, written formal contract for services, a deed with mutual covenants. So, who are these people that should be held responsible for the millions of broken promises, compulsory educational institutions, unpaid laborers, and unpaid military soldiers who fought and died for the uprising of this country, destroyed legacies, cultures and spiritualities, inequality in workplaces, generational poverty, stolen land allotments, racism, concentration camps turned project housing reserved for only a large median of people of color, identity theft and paper genocide, and many, many years of injustice and discrimination? The answer to this question is very complex and will require me to produce multiple segments surrounding this topic to break it all down. But here's a critical example to make note of. The majority of our people now can recall hearing stories about how their ancestors and even some living elders were former sharecroppers, landowners, or farmers. And the way Hollywood paints the picture of American Indians should make you question why you would rarely see authentic photographs, painted or engraved images of the Hollywood depicted version of American Indians working in the fields anywhere across the southeastern region of North America. So, how would millions of American Indians be able to survive if they didn't know how to farm? And for that matter, when did the American Indians have time to set some time aside to teach millions of so-called enslaved American Negroes how to farm? Before these same millions of American Negroes taught the incoming white foreigners from Europe and Africa how to farm? The answer is very simple. The American Indian is the American Negro.
King, you liken these payments to slave reparations, but just factually speaking, how can you say that? These payments are not for anyone descended from slaves. These are payments, they're not even for black farmers who were discriminated against all throughout the 1900s. They're payments specifically for black farmers who the USDA admits were being discriminated against between 1983 and 1997. So how are these slave reparations?
Well, I've sat on the Judiciary Committee for 8 years. I sat through slavery reparation hearings that were held by Chairman John Conyers, and of course through the hearings here on the Pickford Farms claims. And the motivation that comes from this looks to me like there's no resistance on the part of the proponents to hold back or look for fraud in this. They just simply seem to be content with every black farmer that would apply would get what was defined as Judge Friedman and in his opinion as virtually an automatic payment.
Dr. Boyd, let me just ask you specifically, though, staying on this topic. I mean, Representative King has talked about a hypothetical Johnny who was born on a farm, but, quote, went off to the city, became a drug addict, and now wants the $50,000 that comes from the USDA under this claim. How strict is the vetting of these claims?
Well, first of all, I think that that statement has a terrible racial undertone and very, very offensive to our black farmers. And we need to forget here, we help feed the country. We help feed the world. And we paid our price to be in this country and to own land. And what the government done to black farmers is wrong. How strict is the vetting? I mean, Representative King is saying just about anybody who's African American can claim to have been a farmer. So how strict is it? The consent decree says African Americans who farmed or attempted to farm between 1981 and 1997. And the reason we use that definition is because the Civil Rights Office at USDA was closed under the Reagan administration. And we went in and found and investigated and found thousands of black farmer civil rights cases that had never been processed. And that's what this case is about. This case is not about fraud. This case is about bringing justice and equality and fairness to a group of people who deserve it. And it's long overdue justice. Congressman King, it is pretty shocking when you start to look into what happened in the USDA. I mean, they were literally throwing out discrimination claims, just dumping them in the garbage in some cases. You claim 75% of the claims now being made in this program by African American farmers have been fraudulent. You say an unnamed person working for the USDA gave you that estimate. USDA says that percentage is complete nonsense. The FBI has investigated, they say, found only 3 cases of fraud. Where's the proof of this 75% claim you made?
Well, and John Boyd says that there's no fraud. The FBI or the USDA has reported that the FBI came up with 3 cases that they prosecuted. Now, what is the level of fraud here? I've said that I had a district director who was deployed to Washington, D.C. to help administer the distribution of the first $1.05 billion under Pigford. He came back, he among others, with stacks of copies of the documents, sick at heart, and he said at least 75% are fraudulent. And so we can't say that there's no fraud here. Here's what we know. Judge Friedman put in his decision, he wrote 40 acres and a mule in his decision. So I'm not making this part up about reparations. That is the words, that's the code words for reparations.
Wait a minute, sir, I've read that decision, and he just $500. Sir, I've read that decision, and he just used that in a recitation about the history of the interaction between African Americans and the U.S. government and the USDA. He wasn't equating 40 acres and a mule to this program.
Well, and also
let me say, though, Anderson, that he laments that he can't fix all the wrongs of slavery and segregation in one civil rights case. Now he's got a second one.
Mr. King, I want
Dr. Boyd to be able to respond. Dr. Boyd?
Let me talk here. The farmers deserve this restitution. It's long overdue for the black farmers. This is not a rush to judgment. Mr. King has known about this issue. I've testified before him many times before. And this case is about African American farmers who farmed or attempted to farm, who was discriminated against by the United States Department of Agriculture. And I can tell you about discrimination because I had a county official to spit on me and to tear my application up and throw it in the trash can. And I begged and pleaded with the committee to have that person fired. That person was never fired. He was transferred to another county office to continue to work out his service for the United States Department of Agriculture. And they gave him a big party, a big retirement party. So I can tell you that this discrimination is real. And I invite Mr. King to walk in my shoes and other black farmers' shoes around this country before he pass judgment and refer to him as Johnny or someone that has a drug problem. And I tell you that, Anderson, these farmers have proven their case, and they deserve to have their cases heard based on its merit.
I'm just here to make you think.